Hello friends and welcome to February's reading wrap up. Today we're going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of February, do a bit of a review. We're also going to go over my reading stats for the month, and then we're going to take a bit of a look at some of my reading plans for March. So let's dive right in and start with the stats. In February, I logged in my spreadsheet reading 16 books for a total of 4,098 pages. I listed DNFing one of those 16 books. However, there is also another book that I DNF'd very early that I didn't even bother putting in my spreadsheet. Unfortunately, my star rating is an awful lot lower this month than it was last month. Last month, I was thrilled. I had a 4-star average rating, which is incredibly high for me. This month, we're down to just a 3.5, which is lower than my overall average of about 3.7. As you can see from the graph, it's not as though I had an awful reading month where everything I was reading was 1 and 2 stars. In fact, there are none of those. Equally, however, there are no 4.5 or 5 stars. There's no new favorites really this month. All around, I would describe this as a pretty textbook mid kind of month. For the genres that I read, as usual, I read a pretty wide variety, but I think this month I might have read even more widely than I normally do. I had 3 fantasy books, which was my most read genre. Then I had 2 each for horror, lit fic, non-fiction, romance, and sci-fi. And then for classic, historical, and mystery/thriller, there was 1 book each. The vast majority of the books that I read this month were novels. I read a couple of novellas and 3 graphic novels. Almost all of the books that I read this month come from either debut or new to me authors. There were only 2 books this month that were from authors that I had read from before. So the rest of this was all very new territory for me. In terms of how I read these books, as per usual, my highest is mixed reading, where I listen and read at the same time. I did that for 9 of the books. 6 I read just physically, and then 1 was just an ebook. For the audience of the books that I read, 13, so 81% were adult books. 2 of the books that I read were YA and 1 was middle grade. So this is definitely skewed more towards adult than I normally go. As a children's bookseller, I really should be reading a bit more YA and children's. But I think in the back of my head, I knew that March was going to be middle grade March. I'd do plenty of children's reading, hopefully, in this coming month. Slight spoilers, I suppose, for the TBR part of this video, but I kind of let myself off the hook a little bit there. Just 2 of the books that I finished this month were non-fiction, the rest was fiction. In terms of how diverse my reading was this month, I'll always give the caveat that these are just check boxes. They're like an imperfect way to track this, but I still think it's useful. 14 or 88% of the books that I read this month were in some way meaningfully diverse. 8 of them were in some way meaningfully queer. For own voices, again, I know it's imperfect and I don't do like a deep dive on every author trying to figure this out. If it's very easily readily available information, for example in the author's bio or something, that's when I will check that box. So 12 of my books were own voices this month. In terms of where the books are coming from, again, this is imperfect because plenty of people are from multiple places and it feels weird for me to decide which one counts the most to put it in the spreadsheet. But generally speaking, most of the books that I read, 8 of them, so that's half, come from the USA. 2 of the books that I read are from Canada, and then there is 1 each for Palestine, the UK, Japan, Korea, Mexico, and Ireland. None from Australia this month. That's weird for me. Okay, those are the stats. Now let's jump into ranking and reviewing the books. Let's start off with the book that I DNF'd so early that I didn't even bother putting it in my spreadsheet. It is Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh. I honestly don't remember what page I got up to, but it couldn't have been more than 30 or 40. This is a sci-fi book set in space and it's billed as adult, but it reads, at least the first little part, read very, very much like YA. And obviously it goes without saying there is nothing wrong with that inherently, but when I thought I was picking up an adult book and I get what feels like YA to me, I'm gonna be disappointed. I really liked the very, very opening, which is like 2 pages of this textbook about humanity, but my enjoyment pretty much ended there. Once I actually got to chapter 1 and started reading, I wasn't enjoying the setup, I didn't like the writing, and at the end of the day it was that simple. I just wasn't enjoying it, I didn't want to read it, so I stopped. And indeed I stopped so early that I didn't even bother putting it in my spreadsheet. Now a book that I did get a decent way into was Chlorine by Jade Song. I DNF'd at page 85, which for like a 200-page book is definitely a decent chunk. This is one of the books that I read in my video where I was influenced to buy books that booktubers had mentioned in their favorites videos. And a couple of my favorite booktubers loved this book, and I was hopeful I would too. This is a contemporary coming-of-age horror story about a girl who is convinced she's a mermaid. I really liked the concept. Unfortunately for me, it was the writing. The writing I just did not like at all, and the characterization didn't work for me either. I suppose if I'm trying to be generous, I would say that this book has a very strong particular kind of voice, and I think people will either love it or hate it. It seems like most people really like it. I am among the people that it didn't work for. Now from here, all of the books that I finished, even the ones that I didn't really like, I can definitely see an audience for. I don't think that they're bad books. So one of my least favorite reads was Mooncakes. This is actually a young adult graphic novel, and it's kind of romance mixed with supernatural suspense sort of stuff. This is one of the books that I read in my trying out romance reading vlog. And while I really liked the art and I really liked like the casual diverse representation element of this graphic novel, it's a romance between a werewolf and a witch, and I'm not into that. I don't know how else to put it. It didn't really work for me as a romance. I do think there's a lot of really great elements here. It is quite cute. So if you're into that sort of thing, I don't think you can go wrong with this. It just wasn't for me. Now, these next like 3 or 4 books, I could kind of change up the order depending on, I don't know, the day of the week, to be perfectly honest. But I think in terms of enjoyment, Love in the Big City by Sang-Yang Park would be my next lowest. This is another book that I read for my romance reading vlog. This is a contemporary story from Korea about a gay man living in Seoul. And I think it's very much autofiction. It gave me that vibe anyway. And as I alluded to in that video, I think with this book, I just wanted more intimacy with the narrator. I wanted more of a sense of reflection and introspection than what we got. Instead, it was just like a portrayal of this person's lived experience. But I still really appreciate it for what it was. And I think, like I said in that vlog, I'm happy that I read it. I just didn't necessarily love actually reading it, if that makes sense. Now, Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang, another one that I read for my BookTubers Influence Me video. This one I probably personally liked less than Love in the Big City, but there is something about it that I really appreciate in retrospect, even if I didn't like reading it. This is another horror book. I know, look at me reading a bunch of horror this month. In this one, we follow a young woman who is really struggling financially when she gets a great opportunity to work at like a Goop stand-in called Holistic. It's a beauty and wellness clinic for the uber wealthy. And through this, we get to explore concepts around beauty and privilege and white Western beauty standards. This book was doing quite a lot. It was just some of the horror elements that didn't really work for me personally. The way that the author decided to exaggerate certain things that I think were intended to freak you out more and instead just had the opposite effect on me. So whereas with Chlorine, like I understand that people love Chlorine, I genuinely don't understand it. This book, I totally understand why people love it. It just didn't work for me. Now for our first non-fiction of the list. This is Looking After Your Autistic Self by Neve Garvey. And this one, it was fine. It is what it says on the tin, a personalized self-care approach to managing your sensory and emotional well-being. Our author was late diagnosed autistic, and she basically just chats through a bunch of the stuff that has worked for her. There were definitely elements of this that I found useful and that I'll take forward, but overall, I don't know if it was like too focused on her personal story and not enough of the practical, especially when you're picking up a book like this. I was expecting it to be a bit more practical, hands-on, useful information. Some of it I did find helpful just kind of like having written out, but I didn't find this like as useful or helpful as I was hoping I would. Now, another couple of books that I read for my Reading Booktubers, books that they influenced me to buy video. Firstly, we've got Blood in the Mist by Hope Mealy's. This is a classic pre-Tolkien fantasy. And while it is fantasy, like that's kind of the bones of the story, there's an awful lot going on, including a murder mystery at the center of the plot. I liked this more as a curiosity than I did a book. I enjoyed getting to glimpse into the past at what fantasy was before Tolkien. And I did like reading this. I was just kind of hopeful I would love it, which did not turn out to be the case. A book that I liked a lot from that video was Arbor Reality by Rebecca Campbell. This is kind of like a near future sci-fi climate fiction. It's kind of vignettes of different characters over the next century living on Vancouver Island, and we just watch as their lives and lifestyle changes so much as the effects of climate change, particularly wildfires and also pandemics, influence them and essentially just change their entire world. For a very small page count, this book really did manage quite a lot. Next up, we have a couple of graphic novels. One I've already spoken to you about, one I haven't. This one is called Atana and the Firebird. It's a new graphic novel that we got in at work and I've just borrowed it so that I could read it. And it reminded me a little bit of Stardust by Neil Gaiman. In this book, we have a firebird who is kind of like an embodied shooting star. She's part of this race of people who kind of just like fly around in the cosmos. And one day she decides to crash land on Earth and just like see what Earth has got to offer. What's going on down here? When she lands, she meets Etana, who is somebody who is very isolated, living entirely on their own. And together they decide to set out to explore. And when they leave, they quickly discover that they are a whole lot less safe out in this big wide world than they first thought. I couldn't tell you exactly why it reminds me of Stardust, other than like the falling star being a person sort of thing. But it just gave those sort of vibes, those whimsical fairy tale kind of vibes, and I really liked it. The art was very pretty, the dialogue was really easy to follow, it was just a good time. Then the graphic novel that we have spoken about, again, this was in my books that I was influenced to buy video. This is M is for Monster by Talia Dutton, and it's basically a queer Frankenstein retelling where we've got two sisters, one of whom has died. The other sister is trying to bring her back to life. And although she succeeds in reanimating the body is now a different person, and the other sister just kind of finds it very hard to accept this new person. It was a really powerful allegory. I loved the art, and I really liked that like horror framing of a really difficult experience, even though this wasn't necessarily a horror story. In some ways, that rejection and the inherent unsafety of rejection is horrific. So it felt very appropriate, very sensitive, very tender, and I really liked it a lot. I thought it was great. Next up, we have a book that, yes, we did speak about this in my reading romance video, but I have continued to have very conflicting thoughts and feelings about. I loved the reading experience of this. I really just had such a great time. I flew through it. And while reading, it felt like this was going to be a new favorite book. But there have just been a couple of things that have been playing on my mind that make me feel a little hesitant in terms of how I'm going to talk about this. But firstly, this is The Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, who wrote The Hacienda, which is a book I have not yet read. This was my first experience of her. And while I think some people were expecting horror from this, especially expecting the vampires to play a really central role, ultimately, I would describe this as an historical romance with horror elements. It's set in Mexico in the 1940s, and we're following this couple right from when they're young. And then as they get older and the invasion of the Americans into Mexico and the war that ensues. And so while there is a lot going on and there are vampires, at the end of the day, it is the romance that's the center of the book. I loved a lot about this. I loved the writing. I loved the reading experience. I loved it. Now, to be clear, I don't know enough about the history of the colonization of the Americas. I don't know enough about this time and place to have like a strong opinion. And yet something just kind of keeps itching at me and itching away at my love of this book. And the very core of my issue is that Nana, our main character, the female main character, her family own a big ranch in Mexico. They are wealthy landowners, and as far as I can tell, from my very limited knowledge, they are descendants of Spanish colonizers. This book is very much painting the story of the invasion of the Americans into Mexico, which, like, I'm not trying to defend at all. Can you imagine me defending American imperialism? Absolutely not. But equally, there is something about the way that Nana is written and the way that she's characterized that does feel a little bit like the author trying to indigenize her and her family. Did just feel a little bit like appropriating Indigenous belonging to land and Indigenous language around land. And that's not to take away from this book and what it was doing. There was just something about that dynamic and the way that it was written that just felt a little bit off to me. And it has just kind of eroded my sense of adoration for this book in the weeks since I finished it. Next up is a romance that has actually grown in my estimation since I read it in that reading vlog, and this is The 7 Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This is a contemporary romance with a bit of a timey-wimey element. I'm sure you've heard of it. This was on a lot of people's favorites lists last year. And while it did take a little bit to get going for me, I really liked it by the end. I am going to give you a trigger warning, which some people will consider a spoiler, but I think is important, and I personally wish I had have been told before going into this book. I'm not going to go into the details, but if you're especially spoiler sensitive, I'll put up a little thing for you. There is a death in this book, which most people will know going into it. That death was a suicide. And so a lot of this book is our main character coming to terms with the loss of a loved one in this way. And so it does inherently center her experience in that conversation, but I felt like it was handled in a very honest, tender, vulnerable, generous kind of way. And I think the other thing that I really grew to love about this book, especially in hindsight, was the way that it really centered quite a radical sense of love and acceptance of people in their complexity, in their entirety. You know, people change over time, and if we only love one idea of a person, that's not really love. Instead, loving somebody enough to allow them space to grow and change is such a brave and generous act of love, and that was one of my favorite parts of this book. Another book I read in my reading books that I was influenced to buy was The Very Nice Box. This is a contemporary satire, or at least it starts out that way. This is about a woman named Ava who has experienced some incredible tragic loss in her life in the recent past, and now we find her working at a company called Starter, which is essentially a stand-in for IKEA. And her very regimented, routined life is kind of upended when there's a new boss in town. And stuff gets pretty heavy and pretty weird in this book, although it still maintains that satirical humor throughout. This book looks at so many things, from corporate millennial kind of corporate culture to the weaponization of psychology and psychology lingo to power dynamics and classism and gender, and like there's so much going on. And while I do not think this is a perfect book, it was a highly readable one that I just had such a good time with. And although it was juggling an awful lot of themes and concepts, I think it wrapped them all up pretty damn well. Overall, I just had a really good time with this book. Next, we have the book that I reread this month, which was Mimicking of Known Successes. I read this in January. I read it again in February. Not for a video, just in my own time. I felt like rereading it, and I really enjoyed it the second time round too. This is a sci-fi mystery with a bit of like a second chance romance potentially going on. And although I enjoyed the mystery and I liked the sci-fi elements, there was just something about the tone and the atmosphere overall, and I think the characters that just made me fall a little bit in love. I don't know that I would describe this as a new favorite, but I really enjoyed reading it the first time. I enjoyed it the second time. I feel like this is a book that I'll just return to from time to time and just enjoy every moment. Then I think my favorite book of the month was The Miracles of the Namiya General Store by Kaigo Higashino. This was the book that we read for my Blossom Book Club in February. And obviously I mentioned at the beginning that I didn't give any books this month 5 stars. So I don't know that I would go so far as to call this a new favorite, but I did really like reading it. I said in my very brief GoodReads review that this feels like if you crossed Before the Coffee Gets Cold with The Sea of Tranquility. Like The Sea of Tranquility, this is a book set over time, although instead of over centuries, it's over decades. And we get a whole bunch of different points of view and a whole bunch of essentially character studies of people who are all in some way connected to the Namiya General Store. And there was something just so delightful about getting to know all of these very different characters and just watching as each and every story became more and more interconnected with the others. It feels a little bit more Before the Coffee Gets Cold though, I think in tone, but I think the way that that book in particular is written to obviously provide some, you know, moral and existential questions and considerations for the reader. I think this book is doing a similar thing, but maybe just it feels slightly less ham-fisted. Still ham-fisted, just slightly less. Basically, in this story, the Namiya General Store is a place where people would write letters for advice, and they would receive very thoughtful, earnest, sincere letters in return. And we just get to know a whole bunch of people who have been influenced or involved in the Namiya General Store at some point in their lives. At the heart of it, it feels like a story about compassion and kindness and the way that we are all interconnected. It's a reminder of that fact. This whole process of really genuinely trying to provide advice required a level of openness and curiosity about different experiences, and I just really liked the way that it all unfolded. There was one part in the middle where a character was kind of obsessed with the Beatles that probably went on a little bit too long, and I did find myself getting a little bit tired in that section, so that's probably why I didn't end up calling it a new favorite. It was very cute and cozy in a lot of ways, but still very emotionally impactful and intentionally so. The more I'm talking about this, the more I'm thinking I should bump it up to 4.5 stars. I don't know that I could do it to 5, but I did really like it. I had a really good time with this book. And it was my favorite read of the month. Oh, and I did exactly what I thought I would do and forgot the 2 books that I don't have here physically. So let's talk about those quickly. First was A Princess in Theory by Alyssa Cole. This was another romance book that I read in my romance reading vlog. I liked it, didn't love it. It was quite a fun premise, although I did find parts inherent in that premise a little bit stressful. And then finally, the second non-fiction book that I read this month was Light in Gaza. This was a free ebook that was provided by the publisher Haymarket Press, which I think is still available for free, and if it is, I will leave a link in the description box below. This was my book club's January book. I just read it very early February, and it's essentially a very diverse collection of very different essays from people living in Gaza. It was so well done, and I loved how varied the collection was. There was bits of poetry, there was some really personal essays, there was some that leaned more on the academic side. Some of the authors chose to talk about their personal lived experience or detail some of their familial history. Others focused more on, you know, subjects of interest. There was an article about AI. There was another one about architecture. There was another really great one about agriculture in Gaza and the role that agriculture plays in cultural identity and sense of self, as well as resistance. Other articles, their goal was more to envision and imagine a future for Gaza and Palestinians more generally. Ultimately, it was just a very broad and ambitious collection that did deliver on the promise, and I highly recommend it, especially now. Okay, and with that, we have reviewed all of the books that I read in February. Now let's have a little bit of a chat about my reading plans and video plans for March. So obviously the first book that I want to finish in March is Doppelganger. I started this in February, and I did talk about the first half of this book in my video reading books I was influenced to buy. I have read a little bit more of this book, but it's slow going, I'm not gonna lie. And to be perfectly honest with you, I did find particularly one chapter quite difficult to get through. And I do feel like in some ways this book is maybe too ambitious, maybe too long for what it is, but I'm still enjoying it overall. I do still want to finish it, and I hope to do so in March. The other book that I'll definitely be reading this month is Loving Country. This is my Blossom Book Club book for March, and I am so excited about this book. I'm very glad to have the physical copy because there's some absolutely beautiful images. The subtitle, I think, says it all. It's a guide to Sacred Australia, and it says readers are encouraged to discover sacred Australia by reconsidering the accepted history and hearing diverse stories of her Indigenous people. I'm so looking forward to this. I love Bruce Pascoe, and the authors narrate the audiobook, so I think I'm going to dive in and out of the physical and the audio version. This book just seems like a labor of love, and I cannot wait to get into it. Then for the rest of my TBR, I'm going to be honest with you, I do have video plans for March, obviously, but I'm going to be pretty flexible with myself this month. Although I would not describe February as a reading slump, a terrible month by any means, it also wasn't great in terms of my reading, let's be honest. I didn't really feel super thrilled about a whole lot of what I was reading, and that just did get me a little bit down, I'm not gonna lie. So this month I do have a couple of video plans that I may or may not do depending on how I'm feeling and what I want to read. The only video that I have set in stone that I really do want to get to is a reading vlog for middle grade March. And so I have a stack of middle grade here that these are options for me. I don't plan to read all of these. I might read different middle grade books, but these are some of the middle grade books that I'm thinking of getting to. I spoke about these 6 in my video where I recommended a bunch of middle grade, but also spoke about my TBR for middle grade March. So these are definitely my priority books. I hope to get to at least most of these this month. A couple of the other books I was thinking of getting to was We Free Men, which I've been meaning to read for ages now. Maybe I'll get to it in March. This brand new release book is Leo and Ralph by Peter Canavis, who wrote one of my favorite middle grades, My Brother Ben. I read it a couple of years ago. I really liked it. This one seems a little bit younger and a little bit more whimsical, a bit more fun. And then I've borrowed a couple of graphic novels that we had multiple copies of at work. This is Things in the Basement, which I think is a new release graphic novel. And then Nimona, which is definitely not new, but I still have yet to get to it. So I feel like the graphic novels are an almost sure bet. They're pretty easy to get to. I'm not sure how much middle grade I'm going to be reading. I'm not sure which ones I'm going to be reading, but those are some on the table. The only other book that I really want to read this month, and I don't know if I will, I don't know if I'll fit it into a video, is A Tempest of Tea. This was the book that I was most highly anticipating. I only managed to get it right at the end of February, but of course it would just be nice to read this while it's new and then I can hand sell it at work. This is a young adult historical fantasy book and I've just been really looking forward to it. So those are some of the books that I'm thinking about reading. We'll just have to see what happens. As for March's new releases that I have written down as some of the books that I'm looking forward to this year. Now I'm not sure if I'm going to get any or all of these. I'm actually on a little bit of a book buying ban right now, but the books that I'm interested in, maybe just like keeping an eye out, seeing what the reviews are like. The first is called A Botanical Daughter, and I think this is a horror book, which after my experience reading horror in February, maybe I should lay low on that one and just see how things go before I dive in, but I do really like the cover. Then we have a new book coming out by Hala Alian, who I have not yet read from, but I have 2 of her books on my shelf, so I probably won't buy this, but it's a poetry collection and it looks beautiful. It's called The Moon That Turns You Back. So I probably won't be picking that one up right away. Like I said, I've got 2 of her other books on my shelf that I should be reading before I pick up any more, but I think that's probably next on my list in terms of poetry to pick up. But anyway, the other thing I need to do is, of course, thank my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown and Marie. And thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear in the comments how your reading went in February or what you're planning to read in March. And I will talk to you again soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye.